Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been patrolling Yellowstone's backcountry for 17 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Grizzly encounters, sudden blizzards, tourists doing incredibly stupid things, you name it, I've dealt with it. But what happened to me during a routine night patrol in September of 2019 still keeps me awake some nights, listening to every sound outside my cabin. It was a Tuesday evening when I got the call to check on some unusual activity reported near the Lamar Valley. A day hiker had radioed in about what he described as strange lights and sounds coming from the dense forest area about 3 miles north of the main trail. Probably just campers who'd wandered off the designated camping areas, I figured. Happens more often than you'd think, especially during peak season when people get a little too adventurous for their own good. The rain had been coming down steady all day, turning the trails into muddy streams and making visibility poor even with my high-powered flashlight. But I'd done this route hundreds of times before. The Lamar Valley at night is actually pretty peaceful when you get used to it. Just the sound of rain on leaves, maybe an owl hooting in the distance, the occasional elk call echoing across the valley. Nothing I couldn't handle. I parked my Ranger vehicle at the trailhead around 11:30 p.m. and started hiking north toward where the hiker had reported the activity. The rain was lighter now, more of a steady drizzle, but it made every surface slick and treacherous. My boots found purchase on the familiar trail, and I settled into the rhythm of a night patrol. Slow, methodical, alert. About 1.5 miles in, I started hearing something that didn't quite fit with the usual nighttime symphony of the valley. It was faint at first, almost lost in the sound of raindrops hitting my jacket hood. A rhythmic tapping, like someone gently drumming their fingers on wood. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the forest. I stopped walking and pulled back my hood to listen more carefully. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. Not random, like a branch hitting something in the wind. This had a pattern to it. Almost like Morse code, but not quite. I'd learned Morse code during my military service years ago, and while this reminded me of it, the intervals were all wrong. Following protocol, I radioed back to headquarters to report what I was hearing. Base, this is Morrison on night patrol in Lamar Valley. I'm investigating some unusual sounds about 2 miles north of the trailhead. Continuing approach. The response crackled back through my radio. Copy that, Morrison. Keep us posted on anything unusual. You've got backup about 30 minutes out if needed. 30 minutes. In this terrain, at night, in the rain, it might as well have been 30 hours. But I'd been doing this job long enough to know that most mysterious sounds in the wilderness have perfectly ordinary explanations. Probably just a loose piece of metal on an old trail marker tapping in the wind. I continued hiking toward the sound, which was getting louder and more distinct as I approached. But as I got closer, I started to realize that it wasn't coming from one location. It seemed to be moving. The tapping would come from my left for a while, then shift to my right, then back again. Like whatever was making the sound was circling around me, staying just out of sight in the thick forest. That's when I started to feel the first real twinge of unease. In all my years of ranger work, I'd never encountered an animal that behaved like this. Bears don't play games. Mountain lions are ambush predators. They don't announce their presence. Elk, deer, and other wildlife generally want nothing to do with humans and will move away when they detect you coming. The tapping stopped. I stood perfectly still on the muddy trail, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing and the gentle patter of rain. Nothing. Just the normal forest sounds returning. Wind in the trees, water dripping from branches, the distant sound of running water from one of the many streams that cross this area. I waited for about 5 minutes, then started moving forward again. The area where the hiker had reported the strange lights and sounds was still about half a mile ahead. Whatever had been making that tapping noise had either moved on or decided to stop for reasons I couldn't understand. Then I saw the first light. It was a soft, yellowish glow filtering through the trees about 50 yards to my right. Not the harsh white light of a flashlight or the flickering orange of a campfire. This was something in between. Steady but somehow organic, like the light was breathing, growing brighter and dimmer in a slow, regular rhythm. I turned off my flashlight and stood in the darkness, watching. The light continued its rhythmic pulsing for about 30 seconds, then went out completely. I waited, counting slowly to 60, but it didn't return. Probably just campers with some kind of LED lantern, I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew it didn't feel right. The way the light had pulsed, the way it had simply vanished, it didn't match my experience with any camping equipment I'd ever seen. I turned my flashlight back on and started moving toward where I'd seen the light. The terrain here was more challenging, with fallen logs and dense undergrowth making every step treacherous in the wet conditions. I had to move slowly, testing each foothold before committing my full weight. As I pushed through a particularly thick stand of young pines, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Carved into the bark of a large Douglas fir, about 6 feet off the ground, was a symbol I'd never seen before. It looked like a combination of letters and geometric shapes, carved deep enough that the white wood underneath the bark was clearly visible even in the dim light of my flashlight. The carving was fresh. No weathering, no discoloration, no moss or lichen growth. It had been made recently. Very recently. I took out my phone and snapped several photos of the symbol, then radioed back to base. "Morrison here. I've found some kind of carved symbol on a tree. Looks fresh. Sending photos when I get back to civilization." "Copy that. Any sign of the reported activity?" "Negative on the lights right now. Still investigating." That's when the tapping started again. But this time it wasn't coming from the forest around me. It was coming from directly overhead. I looked up, shining my flashlight into the canopy of the tree where the symbol was carved. About 20 feet above me, barely visible through the rain and darkness, something was moving among the branches. Something big enough to make the tapping sound I'd been hearing, but I couldn't make out what it was. The tapping continued for about 10 seconds, then stopped. Whatever was up there had gone quiet, but I could still sense movement in the branches. Leaves rustling in a way that didn't match the gentle wind, small twigs falling down around me. I backed away from the tree slowly, keeping my light trained upward. That's when I saw it. 2 eyes reflecting my flashlight beam back at me from the darkness above. But they were wrong somehow. Too high off the ground to be any animal I was familiar with. Too wide set. And they didn't have the characteristic green or yellow shine of normal animal eyes caught in artificial light. These reflected back a deep, dark red. The eyes blinked once, slowly, then disappeared. I've encountered plenty of dangerous wildlife in my career. I know how to handle bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf that wanders down from the northern ranges. But this was something different. Something that didn't fit into any category of wildlife I'd ever been trained to deal with. My radio crackled to life. "Morrison, what's your status? Your backup is about 15 minutes out." I pressed the transmit button, but my hand was shaking slightly. "Base, I'm not sure what I'm dealing with here. Request immediate backup. Something in the trees that doesn't match any known wildlife behavior." "Copy that. Backup is en route. Can you describe what you're seeing?" I looked back up into the tree, but whatever had been there was gone. No movement, no eyes, no tapping sounds. just the normal sounds of a rainy night in the forest. Negative. Whatever it was, it's moved on. Continuing patrol. But I wasn't continuing patrol. I was getting the hell out of there. I started backing down the trail, keeping my flashlight trained on the tree where I'd seen the eyes. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been from just hiking, and I realized I was genuinely frightened for the first time in years. That's when I heard the voice. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but it was definitely human. A woman's voice, calling out what sounded like, "Help me," from somewhere deeper in the forest. But there was something wrong with it. The tone was off, like someone reading lines from a script without understanding what they meant. Every instinct I'd developed over 17 years of ranger work was screaming at me to ignore that voice and get back to my vehicle. But 17 years of training was also telling me that if someone was genuinely in distress out here, I couldn't just walk away. I keyed my radio. "Base, I'm hearing what sounds like a distress call from deeper in the forest. Female voice calling for help. Am I aware of any missing persons in this area?" "Negative, Morrison. No missing persons reported. Use extreme caution." The voice called out again, and this time I could tell it was definitely coming from the direction where I'd originally been heading, toward where the hiker had reported seeing lights and hearing sounds. Against my better judgment, I started moving toward it. "Help me," the voice called again. Then, after a pause, "Please help me." But as I got closer, I started to notice something that made my blood run cold. The voice was too consistent. The same exact tone, the same exact inflection, the same exact words, like a recording being played over and over again. I stopped walking and listened carefully. After about 30 seconds, I heard it again. "Help me. Please help me." Identical to the previous calls in every way. No human being in genuine distress calls for help like that. When people are really in trouble, their voices change with emotion, with pain, with fear. They provide details about their situation. They don't just repeat the same phrase over and over in exactly the same way. I was backing away from the source of the voice when my flashlight started to flicker. Fresh batteries that morning, no reason for it to be failing now. But the light was getting dimmer and dimmer until finally it went out completely. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, but before I could get it out of my pack, I saw the lights again. This time there were 3 of them, arranged in a perfect triangle about 10 feet off the ground. The same soft, yellowish glow I had seen before, but now they were pulsing in unison. Bright, dim, bright, dim, bright, dim, like a heartbeat made of light. And they were moving toward me, not floating or flying, moving through the forest like they were attached to something walking among the trees. Something big enough to carry 3 lights 10 feet off the ground. Something that was approaching me with deliberate, measured steps. I finally got my backup flashlight working, and when I turned it on, the lights immediately went out. But in the brief moment when my light illuminated the forest in front of me, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Standing about 30 yards away, barely visible in the darkness between the trees, was a shape that might have been human if humans were 9 feet tall and had arms that hung down past their knees. It was perfectly motionless, but I had the distinct impression that it was watching me. My radio crackled. "Morrison, backup is 2 minutes out. What's your location?" I couldn't take my eyes off the shape in the forest, couldn't risk looking away even long enough to check my GPS. "About 2.5 miles north of the trailhead," I managed to say, "following the main trail." "Copy that. We see your position on GPS. Stay put. We're almost there." But the shape was moving again. Not toward me this time, but parallel to my position, keeping the same distance but moving to my left, like it was trying to get between me and the trail back to my vehicle. I started moving backward down the trail, keeping my flashlight trained on the area where I'd seen the shape. My foot slipped on a wet rock and I nearly went down, but I managed to catch myself against a tree without falling. That's when I heard the breathing. It was coming from all around me, like the forest itself was breathing. Deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the trees, from the ground, from the air itself. But underneath the breathing, I could hear something else, a low humming sound, almost below the threshold of human hearing. The humming was getting louder, and I realized it was coming from the direction where my vehicle was parked. Something was between me and my way out. I keyed my radio again. "Base, I need that backup now. Something is blocking my route back to the vehicle. Request immediate assistance." "Copy that, Morrison. Backup is 1 minute out. Can you describe the threat?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, the breathing stopped. The humming stopped. The forest went completely silent, except for the gentle sound of rain. Then I heard my backup arriving, the sound of vehicle doors slamming and footsteps on the muddy trail. I've never been so relieved to hear another human voice in my entire life. "Morrison, where are you?" "Here," I called back, turning toward the sound of their voices. "About half a mile up the trail." I made it back to the trailhead without any further incidents. My backup team, Rangers Ezra Williams and Maxine Chen, listened to my account with the kind of professional skepticism you'd expect from experienced rangers. But they also knew me well enough to know that I wasn't the type to make up stories or let my imagination run wild. We went back to investigate the area where I'd had my encounters, but by then it was nearly 3 a.m. and visibility was still poor due to the rain. We found the tree with the carved symbol. My photos confirmed it was exactly as I described. But there were no other signs of unusual activity. No footprints, no broken branches, no evidence of anything large moving through the forest. The symbol was sent to a researcher at the University of Montana who specializes in Native American petroglyphs and historical markings, but she couldn't identify it as belonging to any known cultural tradition. It didn't match any historical symbols from the tribes that had traditionally lived in the Yellowstone area, and it didn't correspond to any modern marking system used by researchers or park services. I filed my report and went through the standard debriefing process. Officially, the incident was classified as unusual wildlife behavior, species unknown, and added to the small but growing file of unexplained encounters that every major national park accumulates over the decades. But I know what I saw out there. I know what I heard. And I know that something in the deep forest of Yellowstone was mimicking human speech, manipulating light in ways that shouldn't be possible, and watching me with eyes that reflected the wrong color. The thing that bothers me most isn't what happened that night. It's what's been happening since then. 3 weeks after my encounter, another ranger reported hearing rhythmic tapping sounds during a night patrol in the same general area. She didn't investigate as thoroughly as I had, but she described the sounds as deliberate and unnatural. 6 weeks later, a group of backpackers reported seeing unexplained lights in the forest near Lamar Valley. They described them as pulsing yellow orbs that seemed to follow us for about a mile before disappearing. And 2 months after that, a day hiker found another carved symbol on a tree about 5 miles from where I'd found the first one. Different design, but carved with the same precision and obvious freshness. Whatever I encountered that night, it's still out there, still watching, still learning. And every time I go out on patrol, especially during the night shifts, I find myself listening for that rhythmic tapping, scanning the tree line for unexplained lights, and wondering if those red eyes are watching me from the darkness. The official reports describe these incidents as isolated anomalies with no clear connection, but I know better. I know that something is living in the deep forest of Yellowstone, something that's becoming bolder and more active, something that's learning to mimic human behavior with disturbing accuracy. Last week, I was assigned to another night patrol in the Lamar Valley area. Standard routine check. Nothing unusual reported. But as I was hiking back to my vehicle around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice, calling out from the darkness. "Help me. Please help me." Perfect mimicry. Exactly my tone, exactly my inflection. And I realized that whatever is out there has been listening to us, learning from us, practicing. I didn't investigate. I didn't radio for backup. I got in my vehicle and drove straight back to headquarters, and I put in for a transfer to day shifts only. Because if that thing has learned to mimic human speech perfectly, if it's learning to use our own voices against us, then I don't want to be out there when it decides to become more aggressive. The Lamar Valley is beautiful during the day, peaceful, safe. But at night, when the rain is falling and the darkness is thick enough to hide anything, I know that something is out there watching, learning, and waiting. And someday, when it's ready, it's going to stop mimicking human voices and start using them for something much worse. Working as a ranger in Yellowstone, you learn pretty quickly that people disappear in the wilderness for all sorts of reasons. Most of the time, they turn up safe and sound within a few hours. They took a wrong turn, got disoriented, or simply lost track of time. Sometimes they turn up injured but alive. And sometimes, unfortunately, they don't turn up at all. But in my 12 years of service here, I've never dealt with anything quite like what happened at Shoshone Lake during the summer of 2021. It started on a Thursday morning in late June when I got a radio call about overdue campers. A family of 4, Robert and Susan Kellerman and their 2 teenage kids, Amy and Marcus, had been expected to check out of backcountry campsite 8K3 that morning, but they hadn't shown up at the backcountry office to return their permit and camping gear. This happens more often than you might think. People get a late start, decide to take their time hiking out, maybe stop for photos or wildlife viewing. The Kellermans had been issued a 3-day permit for 8K3, which is a beautiful but isolated site on the northwestern shore of Shoshone Lake. It's about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by foot, and popular with families looking for a true wilderness experience. The protocol for overdue campers is pretty straightforward. We give them until noon to check in before we start making phone calls. If they don't respond to radio calls or cell phone attempts, we organize a search party to hike out to their last known location. By 2 p.m., we hadn't heard anything from the Kellermans, and none of our radio calls to the backcountry frequencies had gotten a response. Cell service is sporadic at best around Shoshone Lake, so that wasn't necessarily concerning. But 4 people being 6 hours overdue was enough to warrant a welfare check. I volunteered to hike out to campsite 8K3 with Ranger Delbert Hawkins, who had been working the Shoshone area longer than anyone. We loaded up with emergency medical supplies, extra food and water, and communication equipment, then started the 8-mile hike from the DeLacy Creek trailhead. It's a beautiful hike under normal circumstances. The trail winds through dense lodgepole pine forest, crosses several meadows full of wildflowers, and offers spectacular views of the lake once you get close to the shoreline. But when you're hiking to check on potentially missing people, the beauty of the landscape becomes secondary to the growing sense of urgency. We made good time and reached campsite 8K3 around 5:30 p.m. What we found there immediately told us this wasn't going to be a routine overdue camper situation. The campsite was completely abandoned, but not in the way you'd expect if a family had simply packed up and left. Their tent was still standing, guy lines properly secured, rain fly in place. The camp kitchen area was still set up with their portable stove, cooking pots, and food supplies neatly arranged on the bear box. 2 pairs of hiking boots were lined up next to the tent entrance, and I could see clothing hanging on a makeshift line strung between 2 trees. But there were no people anywhere. Delbert and I split up to search the immediate area around the campsite. The site is situated in a small clearing about 50 yards from the lakeshore, surrounded on 3 sides by dense forest. There's only one official trail leading in and out, though experienced hikers sometimes create their own routes through the woods. I checked the shoreline first, looking for any signs that the family might have gone swimming or fishing. Shoshone Lake is cold even in summer. Surface temperatures rarely get above 60 degrees. But it's popular for fishing and some hardy souls do swim in it. But I didn't find any fishing gear by the water, no towels or swimwear, nothing to suggest they had planned to spend time by the lake that morning. Delbert was examining the campsite itself, and when I returned from the shoreline, he had a concerned look on his face. "Something's not right here," he said, pointing to the tent. "Look at this." I followed him over to the family's tent, a large 4-person dome style that was still fully erected and properly secured. But when Delbert unzipped the entrance flap, I could see what had concerned him. All 4 sleeping bags were laid out exactly as you'd expect if people were planning to sleep in them that night. Personal items were scattered around the tent floor: books, toiletries, extra clothing, phone chargers. Amy Kellerman's journal was open to an entry dated that morning, with a pen lying beside it as if she'd been interrupted while writing. But most concerning of all, everyone's personal identification and important documents were still there. Driver's licenses, credit cards, medical insurance cards, all the things that people absolutely do not leave behind when they pack up a campsite to hike out. "They didn't break camp," I said. "They just left everything and walked away." "Or something made them leave everything and walk away," Delbert replied grimly. We radioed back to headquarters to report our findings and request additional search personnel. Then we began a systematic search of the area around the campsite, looking for any signs of which direction the family might have gone. That's when we found the first really disturbing evidence. About 100 yards east of the campsite, in a small meadow that opens up between the forest and the lake, Delbert found a trail of footprints in the soft earth. 4 sets of prints heading away from the campsite in a roughly northeastern direction, toward the deep forest that covers most of the Shoshone Lake backcountry. But the pattern of the footprints was all wrong. They weren't walking in the relaxed, irregular pattern you'd expect from a family out for a morning hike. Instead, all 4 sets of prints were in a perfectly straight line, one behind the other, with exactly the same spacing between each step, like they were marching in formation. More disturbing still, the footprints showed no signs of deviation or hesitation. No pausing to look at wildlife, no stepping aside to avoid obstacles, no casual wandering of the kind that families typically do when they're exploring wilderness areas. Just a straight line of perfectly spaced footprints heading directly into the most remote and difficult terrain in the area. "This doesn't look like voluntary movement," Delbert said, studying the prints. "This looks like they were being directed or compelled to walk in a specific pattern." We followed the trail of footprints for about half a mile before they disappeared at the edge of a rocky area where the ground became too hard to hold clear impressions. But the direction they'd been heading was deeply concerning, straight into a section of forest that's not marked by any official trails and is generally considered too difficult for casual hikers to navigate safely. By this time, the sun was getting low, and we were running out of daylight. Searching dense forest for 4 missing people requires proper equipment and enough personnel to do it safely. We marked the location where we'd lost the trail, then hiked back to the campsite to secure the scene for the major search effort that would begin at first light. That night, back at Ranger headquarters, we organized the largest search and rescue operation the park had seen in years. Over 30 rangers, volunteers, and search and rescue specialists would fan out across the Shoshone Lake backcountry, following every possible route the Kellerman family might have taken. But even as we planned the search, questions kept nagging at me about what we'd found at the campsite. Why would a family of 4 abandon their camp so completely? Why were they walking in such a precise, military-like formation? And why would they head directly into some of the most challenging terrain in the area instead of staying on established trails? The search began at dawn on Friday morning. Teams approached the area from multiple directions, using GPS coordinates to ensure we covered every possible square mile where the family might have gone. We had helicopters scanning from above, K9 units following scent trails, and experienced trackers examining every piece of ground for signs of passage. By noon, we had found absolutely nothing. No additional footprints, no torn clothing caught on branches, no personal items dropped along the way. It was as if the Kellerman family had simply walked into the forest and vanished completely. That afternoon, one of our K9 teams made a discovery that added a new layer of mystery to the case. About 2 miles from the campsite, in a direction completely different from where we'd found the footprints, the dogs detected a scent trail. But when the handlers followed the trail, it led to something that didn't make any sense. In a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, the dogs found a pile of clothing. 4 complete sets. Hiking pants, shirts, underwear, socks. All neatly folded and stacked in the center of the clearing, as if someone had carefully undressed and arranged their clothes before walking away. But there were no footprints leading to or from the clothing pile. No signs of a struggle, no indication of how the clothes had gotten there. And most puzzling of all, the K9 teams confirmed that these were definitely the Kellerman's clothes. The scent trail was unmistakable. How do 4 people walk 2 miles through dense forest and leave their clothes in a clearing without leaving any footprints? I asked the lead K9 handler. They don't, he replied. This doesn't match any normal human behavior pattern we've ever encountered. We expanded the search area again, but by evening on Friday, we still had no sign of the family themselves, just their abandoned campsite, a trail of footprints that disappeared into rocky terrain, and a pile of their clothing in a clearing 2 miles away with no explanation for how it had gotten there. Saturday's search was even more intensive. We brought in additional helicopter support and expanded our search radius to cover nearly 20 square miles of wilderness. Searchers combed through every ravine, checked every cave, followed every stream and game trail in the area. Nothing. 4 people don't just disappear without a trace in wilderness areas, especially when they're not experienced backcountry travelers. The Kellermans were what we'd consider typical family campers, reasonably fit, adequately equipped, but not the type to go off-trail into challenging terrain. They had no survival training, no experience with serious wilderness navigation, and no reason to abandon their campsite and belongings. By Sunday evening, after 4 days of intensive searching with no results, the official search and rescue operation was scaled back to periodic helicopter overflights and routine patrol checks. The case was turned over to criminal investigators, and missing persons reports were filed with appropriate law enforcement agencies. But for those of us who had been directly involved in the search, the case wasn't closed. It was haunting. Over the following weeks, I found myself hiking back to the Shoshone Lake area during my off-duty time, looking for anything we might have missed. I wasn't the only one. Several other rangers were doing the same thing, unable to let go of the mystery of what had happened to the Kellerman family. About a month after the disappearance, I was hiking alone near campsite 8K3 when I found something that made my blood run cold. In the same meadow where we'd originally found the trail of footprints, there was a new pattern of marks in the earth. Not footprints this time, but something else. Geometric shapes pressed into the soft soil. Circles, triangles, and lines arranged in complex patterns that definitely weren't natural. I photographed everything and reported it immediately. But when other rangers came out to investigate the next day, the marks were gone. The entire area had been disturbed, as if someone had carefully raked over the ground to eliminate any trace of what I'd seen. That's when I started to suspect that whatever had happened to the Kellerman family wasn't over. 2 weeks later, another family reported strange experiences while camping at a site about 5 miles from where the Kellermans had disappeared. The Morrison family, parents and 3 young children, told park rangers that they had been awakened in the middle of the night by what sounded like voices calling to them from the forest. "It sounded like children calling for help," Mrs. Morrison told me during the interview. "But when we listened carefully, we realized the voices were calling our children's names, all of their names, pronounced exactly correctly, but we hadn't told anyone in the area what our kids were named." Mr. Morrison added that the voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if they were surrounded by people in the forest. But when they used flashlights to look outside their tent, they couldn't see anyone. "The voices kept calling for about 20 minutes, he said. Then they just stopped all at once, like someone had turned off a radio. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night." The Morrison family packed up and left the wilderness area the next morning, cutting their planned week-long camping trip short. They filed a report with park rangers, but officially there wasn't much we could do. Strange sounds in the wilderness aren't uncommon, and while the experience had clearly frightened them, no actual threats had been made. But I knew there was a connection to the Kellerman disappearance. The location was too close, the circumstances too similar. Something was happening in the Shoshone Lake backcountry that didn't fit any normal patterns of wilderness activity. 3 months after the Kellermans disappeared, I was assigned to escort a criminal investigator from the FBI to examine the original campsite area. Agent Patricia Coleman was a specialist in missing persons cases, and she wanted to personally review the scene where the family had last been seen. We hiked out to campsite 8K3 on a clear September morning. The site had been officially closed to camping since the disappearance, but we wanted to check for any evidence that might have been missed during the original search. Agent Coleman was thorough and professional, examining every detail of the campsite area with the kind of systematic precision you'd expect from a federal investigator. But after several hours of investigation, she seemed as puzzled as the rest of us. "In 20 years of missing persons work, I've never seen a case like this," she told me as we prepared to hike back out. 4 people don't just vanish without leaving some kind of trail. There's always something: disturbed vegetation, personal items, some kind of physical evidence. But here it's like they just ceased to exist. We were about a mile from the campsite, hiking back toward the trailhead, when Agent Coleman suddenly stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I listened carefully, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. Just the normal sounds of the forest, wind in the trees, birds calling, the distant sound of water from Shoshone Creek. "What are you hearing?" I asked. "Voices," she said. "Very faint, but definitely human voices, coming from behind us." I turned around and listened again, straining to pick up whatever she was hearing. After about 30 seconds, I caught it, barely audible, but definitely there. Multiple voices, too distant to make out words, coming from the direction of the lake. "Should we go back and investigate?" I asked. Agent Coleman considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "Let's get back to communication range and call for backup first. If there are people back there, we want adequate support before we approach them." But by the time we hiked out to where we could get radio contact with headquarters, and by the time backup rangers arrived to return to the lake with us, the voices had stopped. We spent the rest of the afternoon searching the entire campsite area again, but found no signs that anyone had been there. Agent Coleman's official report concluded that the Kellerman family had most likely become lost in the wilderness and died of exposure or injury in some remote location where their bodies hadn't yet been found. It was a reasonable conclusion based on the available evidence, but it didn't explain the abandoned clothing, the strange footprint patterns, or the ongoing reports of unusual activity in the area. 6 months after the disappearance, in December of 2021, a cross-country skier found something in the forest about 10 miles from Shoshone Lake that reignited interest in the case. Carved into the bark of a large pine tree, about 8 feet off the ground, were 4 names: Robert, Susan, Amy, and Marcus. Below the names was carved a date, the same date the Kellerman family had disappeared. But the carving wasn't fresh. It was weathered and aged, as if it had been there for years. Forest Service experts who examined the carving estimated that it had been made at least 5 to 10 years earlier, based on the amount of bark growth and weathering around the cuts, which was impossible, because the Kellerman family hadn't visited Yellowstone until 2021. The discovery of the carved names brought federal investigators back to the case, but their investigation only deepened the mystery. Carbon dating of the tree bark confirmed that the carving had indeed been made years before the Kellerman family's visit to the park. Yet the names were spelled exactly correctly, including Amy's unusual middle name that she went by, Celeste, carved right below her first name in precise, deliberate letters. I accompanied the investigative team when they examined the carved tree, and what I saw there has stayed with me ever since. The carving wasn't just names and a date. Below the family information, carved in the same aged style, was a message. They called to us from the forest. We had to follow. We had to join them. And below that, in fresher cuts that looked much more recent, others will follow. The FBI expanded their investigation to include historical missing persons cases in the Yellowstone area, looking for any patterns that might connect to the Kellerman disappearance. What they found was deeply disturbing. Over the past 30 years, 17 people had gone missing in the wilderness areas around Shoshone Lake. Not all at once, not in any obvious pattern, but scattered across 3 decades in incidents that had all been classified as individual tragedies. Solo hikers who got lost, inexperienced campers who made fatal mistakes, accidents that could happen to anyone in the wilderness. But when the cases were examined together, patterns emerged. In 12 of the 17 disappearances, the missing persons' campsites had been found abandoned but intact, with personal belongings left behind. In 9 cases, other campers in the area had reported hearing unexplained voices calling from the forest in the days before or after the disappearances. And in 6 cases, clothing or personal items belonging to the missing persons had been found in remote locations with no explanation for how they had gotten there. Most disturbing of all, in 8 of the cases, other visitors to the area had reported encounters with people in the forest who had claimed to be the missing persons. People who looked right, sounded right, knew personal details they shouldn't have known, but who behaved in strange, unsettling ways before disappearing back into the wilderness. The Morrison family's report of voices calling their children's names wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had been going on for decades. I requested copies of all the historical missing persons files, and what I read in those reports changed the way I think about the wilderness areas of Yellowstone forever. In 1993, a solo hiker named Michael Chen disappeared while camping near Shoshone Lake. 3 days after he was reported missing, 2 other hikers encountered someone who claimed to be Michael on a trail about 5 miles from his abandoned campsite. The man knew details about Michael's life, his job, his family, but the hikers later told investigators that something about the encounter had felt wrong. He kept repeating the same phrases over and over. One of the hikers reported, like he was reading from a script, and his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. They didn't track properly when he looked at you. The supposed Michael Chen had asked the hikers to follow him deeper into the forest, claiming he needed help finding his way back to civilization. But something about his demeanor had made them uncomfortable, and they had declined. The man had then walked away into the forest and was never seen again. The real Michael Chen's body was never found. In 1998, a family of 3 had disappeared from a campsite less than 2 miles from where the Kellermans would vanish 23 years later. The Henderson family, parents David and Mary and their teenage daughter Jennifer, had been found missing from their campsite with all their belongings intact. Searchers had found their trail leading into the forest in a perfectly straight line, just like the Kellerman footprints. 6 months after the Hendersons disappeared, a group of researchers conducting wildlife surveys in the area reported encountering 3 people who claimed to be the missing family. But the encounter had been deeply unsettling. "They approached our camp around midnight," the lead researcher wrote in his report. "They said they were lost and needed help, but they were wearing the exact same clothes they'd been reported missing in 6 months earlier. The clothes were clean, undamaged, like they'd just put them on. But they'd supposedly been living in the wilderness for half a year." The researchers had offered to escort the supposed Henderson family back to civilization, but the 3 people had declined, saying they needed to check with the others first. When asked what others, they had simply repeated the phrase, "the others," several times before walking away into the darkness. The strangest part, the researchers' report continued, was that they moved in perfect synchronization. When one turned their head, all 3 turned their heads in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. When one took a step, they all stepped with the same foot in the same rhythm. It was like watching 3 puppets being controlled by the same puppeteer. Case after case, the pattern was the same. People disappeared from campsites with their belongings intact. Straight-line trails led into the wilderness. Other visitors reported encounters with people who claimed to be the missing persons, but who behaved in disturbing, unnatural ways. And always, there were reports of voices calling from the forest. Voices that knew personal information they shouldn't have known. Voices that tried to lure other campers into the wilderness. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the Kellerman family hadn't simply gotten lost or had an accident. They had become part of something that had been happening in the Shoshone Lake area for decades. Something that was still active, still growing, still calling to new victims from the darkness of the deep forest. My suspicions were confirmed in March of 2022, when I had my own encounter with what I believed were the missing Kellermans. I was conducting a routine patrol of the backcountry areas around Shoshone Lake, checking on early-season trail conditions and wildlife activity. It was a solo patrol, which wasn't unusual for routine checks, but given the history of disappearances in the area, I was carrying extra communication equipment and had a detailed check-in schedule with headquarters. I was hiking along the shoreline trail about 3 miles from where the Kellermans had disappeared when I saw 4 figures standing in a clearing ahead of me. Even from a distance, I could tell they were arranged in a perfect line, facing the trail. As I got closer, my heart started pounding. The 4 people looked exactly like the Kellerman family. The right ages, the right build, even what appeared to be the same clothing they'd been wearing when they disappeared 9 months earlier. But something was wrong with the way they were standing. Too still, too perfectly aligned. And when I got close enough to see their faces clearly, I understood why every previous witness had described these encounters as deeply unsettling. Their eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils. The entire visible portion of their eyes was a flat, light-absorbing black that seemed to extend into their faces like holes. Ranger Hartwell, the figure that looked like Robert Kellerman, said in a voice that was perfectly his, down to the slight Midwestern accent I remembered from his initial backcountry permit interview. "We've been waiting for you." I stopped walking immediately, my hand moving instinctively to my radio. "Mr. Kellerman? Is that you? Your family has been missing for 9 months. We need to get you medical attention immediately." "We're fine," said the figure that looked like Susan Kellerman. "We're better than fine. We're part of something wonderful now." "We want to show you," added the Amy figure. "Come with us. Come see what we've found. Come see what found us," said the Marcus figure. All 4 of them were smiling, but their smiles were wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth, held too rigidly. And they were speaking in perfect unison, their voices overlapping in a way that created an unsettling harmonic effect. "I need to radio for medical evacuation," I said, slowly backing away from them. "You've been missing for 9 months. You need medical care." "We don't need medical care," they said in unison. "We need you to come with us. Everyone needs to come with us. Everyone needs to join us." That's when I noticed that their feet weren't quite touching the ground. They were hovering about an inch above the forest floor, perfectly motionless except for their mouths and those horrible black eyes. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Hartwell. I have visual contact with 4 individuals matching the description of the missing Kellerman family, requesting immediate backup and medical evacuation to my current position." The 4 figures tilted their heads in perfect synchronization, like birds examining something interesting. "You can't call for help," they said. "The others won't let you." That's when I realized my radio was completely silent. No static, no carrier tone, nothing. It was as if all electromagnetic signals in the area had simply been cut off. "Come with us," the figures repeated. "Come see what we've become. Come become what we are." They started moving toward me, not walking, but gliding across the forest floor in that same perfect formation they'd maintained since I first saw them. And as they moved, I could hear other voices joining theirs from the forest around me. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all saying the same thing in unison. "Come with us. Come see. Come become." I ran. I've never run from anything in 12 years of ranger work, but I ran from those things that claimed to be the Kellerman family. I ran through the forest, stumbling over roots and branches, not caring about proper trail safety or radio protocols. I just ran until I was far enough away that the voices faded and my radio started working again. When backup rangers reached my location an hour later, there was no sign of the 4 figures. No footprints, no disturbance of the forest floor, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. But carved into a tree at the exact spot where I'd encountered them was a fresh message. "Ranger Hartwell will join us soon." I requested a transfer out of the Shoshone Lake area the next day. I couldn't continue working in a place where I knew something was actively hunting for new victims, something that had been collecting people for decades and using their appearances to lure others into the wilderness. My transfer was approved, and I'm now working in a different section of the park. But I still monitor reports from the Shoshone Lake area, and the pattern continues. Just last month, another family was reported overdue from a camping trip in the same general area where the Kellermans disappeared. When rangers investigated, they found the familiar signs: abandoned campsite with all belongings intact, trail of footprints leading into the wilderness in a perfectly straight line, clothing found neatly folded in a clearing with no explanation for how it got there. The Morrison family, the same family who had reported hearing voices calling their children's names, was reported missing 3 days after the latest disappearance. Other campers in the area reported seeing 5 figures standing in formation at the edge of the forest. 2 adults and 3 children, all with black eyes, all smiling those 2 wide smiles. "Come join us," the witnesses reported hearing. "Come see what we've found. Come become what we are." I know that someday, those voices are going to call to someone who won't be able to resist. Someone who will follow them into the deep forest and become part of whatever is collecting people in the wilderness around Shoshone Lake. And I know that when that happens, there will be one more voice calling from the darkness, one more figure standing in formation at the edge of the forest, waiting for the next victim to join their growing collection. The official reports describe these incidents as isolated missing persons cases with no clear connection. But I know the truth. Something is living in the deep wilderness of Yellowstone, something that's been hunting for decades, something that's learned to perfectly mimic human appearance and behavior for the purpose of luring new victims. The voices are still calling from the forest around Shoshone Lake. They're still waiting for someone to follow them into the darkness. And based on the pattern of disappearances over the past 30 years, they're not going to stop until they've collected everyone who dares to venture into their territory. Whatever happened to the Kellerman family, whatever they've become, they're not victims anymore. They're part of the hunting party now, and they're looking for new people to join their collection. The wilderness of Yellowstone is vast and beautiful, but there are some places where humans were never meant to go. Some places where something else has been waiting for a very long time, something that knows how to use our own faces and voices against us. The Shoshone Lake area remains open to the public. Families still camp there, hikers still explore the wilderness trails, and most of them have wonderful, safe experiences. But sometimes, when the conditions are right, when the forest is quiet and the shadows are deep, you might hear voices calling from the darkness. Voices that know your name, that know your family, that know exactly what to say to make you follow them into the trees. And if you do follow those voices, if you let them lead you away from the safety of the established trails, you might discover what happened to the Kellerman family. You might find out what they've become, and you might never find your way back to being human again. In 32 years of working as a ranger in Yellowstone, I thought I'd seen every type of animal track that could possibly exist in this ecosystem. Bear tracks, wolf tracks, mountain lion tracks, elk, deer, moose, bison, even the occasional lynx or wolverine print that gets the wildlife biologists all excited. But what I found near the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone in August of 2020 didn't match anything in my field guides, anything in the park's extensive wildlife databases, or anything in my 3 decades of wilderness experience. I was conducting a routine trail assessment along the North Rim Trail when I came across the first set of prints. The trail had been closed for 2 weeks due to erosion damage from heavy spring rains, and I was checking to see if it was safe to reopen for public use. It's a popular trail, offers some of the best views of the lower falls you can get without rappelling equipment, so there was pressure from park management to get it reopened as soon as possible. The prints were in a muddy section about 2 miles from the Canyon Village trailhead, in an area where the trail curves close to the canyon rim. At first glance, they looked almost human, bipedal, roughly the right size for a person wearing large boots. But when I knelt down to examine them more closely, I realized they were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each print was about 14 inches long and 6 inches wide at the broadest point, much larger than any human foot, even accounting for boots or other footwear. But the shape was wrong for any known animal in the area. Too narrow for bear prints, wrong configuration for elk or moose, and definitely not consistent with any of the big cats we occasionally see in the park. What really caught my attention was the depth of the impressions. These weren't the shallow marks you'd expect from something just walking across muddy ground. These prints were pressed deep into the earth, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy, much heavier than a human, heavier even than the largest black bears we have in the area. But the most unsettling aspect of the tracks was their spacing and alignment. They formed a perfectly straight line along the trail, with exactly the same distance between each print. No variation, no adjustment for terrain, no natural variance in stride length that you'd expect from any living creature moving through wilderness. I photographed the prints from multiple angles and measured them carefully, then continued my trail assessment. About half a mile further along, I found more of the same tracks, same size, same depth, same unnatural precision in spacing. But this time, the trail led off the established path and toward the canyon rim. Following agency protocol for unusual wildlife signs, I marked the location with GPS coordinates and continued following the tracks to see where they led. The prints headed directly toward one of the more dangerous overlooks, an area where the canyon rim juts out over a sheer drop of nearly 400 feet to the Yellowstone River below. What I found at the overlook still gives me chills when I think about it. The tracks led right to the edge of the cliff and stopped. not turned around, not veered away from the dangerous drop-off, just stopped, as if whatever had made them had walked directly off the cliff into empty air. I spent nearly an hour examining the area around the overlook, looking for any sign that the creature had changed direction or found another route. But there was nothing. The tracks ended at the cliff edge, and there were no corresponding marks on any surface below that would suggest something had fallen or jumped. I radioed back to headquarters to report the unusual findings. "Base, this is Whitfield on North Rim Trail Assessment. I've found some unusual animal tracks that don't match any known species in the area. Requesting consultation with wildlife biology team." The response came back within minutes. "Copy that, Whitfield. Can you describe the tracks?" I gave them the basic details: size, shape, depth, and the concerning fact that they led directly to a cliff edge with no apparent continuation. There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded. "Whitfield, we're going to send Dr. Sarah Chen from the Wildlife Biology Division to meet you on the trail. Can you remain at your current location until she arrives?" Dr. Chen was the park's senior mammalogist, someone I'd worked with dozens of times over the years on various wildlife management issues. If anyone could identify these tracks, it would be her. I settled in to wait, taking additional photographs and measurements while I had the time. Dr. Chen arrived about 2 hours later, hiking in from the canyon village with a full field kit of measurement tools, cameras, and reference materials. I'd worked with her long enough to read her expressions, and I could tell she was skeptical about my report until she saw the tracks for herself. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, kneeling down next to the first clear print. "What the hell made these?" She spent the next hour examining the tracks with scientific thoroughness, taking measurements, soil samples, photographs from every conceivable angle. I watched her compare the prints to field guides for every large mammal species that had ever been documented in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, including historical species that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Nothing matched. "The size suggests something in the 800 to 1,200 pound range," she said, showing me her calculations. "But the foot structure doesn't correspond to any known North American mammal in that weight class. Bears have 5 toes with claws, and the pad structure is completely different. Bison and elk have hooves. Mountain lions have retractable claws and totally different pad arrangements." "What about something that escaped from captivity?" I asked. "Zoo animal, circus animal, exotic pet?" "I thought about that," Dr. Chen replied. "But there aren't any facilities in the region that house animals large enough to make tracks like this. And even if there were, you'd expect to see more human activity around an escaped large animal. Search teams, tranquilizer equipment, that sort of thing." We followed the track trail to the cliff edge overlook, and Dr. Chen's scientific composure cracked slightly when she saw where the prints ended. "This doesn't make biological sense," she said. "No animal walks directly off a cliff. There's always some kind of self-preservation behavior, sniffing at the edge, testing the ground, backing away when they sense the drop-off. But these tracks show no hesitation, no awareness of danger." "Maybe whatever made them couldn't see the cliff edge," I suggested. "Poor eyesight? Moving at night?" "Possible, but unlikely. Most large mammals have excellent night vision, and this overlook is exposed enough that even a partially blind animal would sense the change in wind patterns and sound echoes that indicate a major drop-off." Dr. Chen collected soil samples from the tracks and arranged for them to be sent to the University of Montana for analysis. She also consulted with colleagues at other national parks and wildlife research facilities, sharing photographs and measurements to see if anyone had encountered similar tracks elsewhere. The results, when they came back 2 weeks later, only deepened the mystery. The soil analysis confirmed that the tracks had been made by something extremely heavy pressing down with significant force. But there were no biological residues in the soil, no skin cells, hair, bodily fluids, or other organic material that you'd expect to find in tracks left by living animals. More puzzling still, spectroscopic analysis of the soil samples revealed trace amounts of metallic compounds that don't occur naturally in the Yellowstone geology. Iron, nickel, and chromium in concentrations that suggested contact with some kind of manufactured material. "It's like something metallic and extremely heavy pressed these shapes into the ground," Dr. Chen told me when she briefed me on the lab results. But I can't explain how that would happen, or what would create this particular pattern. I filed my report and moved on to other duties, but the mystery of the tracks nagged at me. In quiet moments, I found myself thinking about what could possibly have made those prints. What could have walked in such a precise line directly to a cliff edge without any apparent concern for the danger? 3 weeks after the initial discovery, I got a radio call that brought the mystery back into sharp focus. "Whitfield, we need you to respond to an incident at Artist Point Overlook. We've got a missing person situation that may be related to your track findings." Artist Point is another popular overlook about 2 miles from where I'd found the tracks, offering spectacular views of the lower falls from the opposite side of the canyon. It's heavily trafficked during tourist season, with well-maintained trails and safety barriers to keep visitors away from dangerous drop-offs. When I arrived at Artist Point, I found a scene that immediately reminded me of the mysterious tracks I'd discovered weeks earlier. A tourist named David Brennan had been reported missing by his wife after he failed to return from what should have been a short walk to take photographs at the overlook. Mrs. Brennan told investigators that her husband had left their hotel around 6 a.m. to catch the sunrise lighting on the falls, planning to be back by 8 a.m. for breakfast. When he didn't return by noon, she contacted park rangers. A search of the Artist Point area found his camera equipment set up on a tripod at the edge of the overlook, still pointed toward the falls with the lens cap off as if he'd been preparing to take a photograph. But David Brennan was nowhere to be found. What made the situation even stranger was what searchers found in the muddy ground around the overlook. Mixed in with the normal boot prints from tourists were the same type of unusual tracks I'd discovered weeks earlier, large, unnaturally deep impressions that didn't match any known animal species. But this time, the tracks weren't alone. Alongside them, clearly visible in the soft earth, was a trail of normal human boot prints that exactly matched the treads on David Brennan's hiking boots. The 2 sets of tracks, the mysterious large prints and Brennan's boot prints, ran parallel to each other for about 50 yards, starting from the parking area and heading directly toward the cliff edge overlook. "It looks like he was walking alongside something," the lead investigator told me as we examined the trail. "Something large enough to make these deep prints. But there's no sign of a struggle or any indication that he was being forced to accompany whatever it was." We followed both sets of tracks to the cliff edge, where they simply ended. Just like the mysterious tracks I'd found earlier, both trails led directly to the precipice and stopped. No signs of a fall, no disturbance of the rocks or vegetation below, no indication of what had happened to either the missing man or whatever had been walking with him. The search for David Brennan continued for 5 days, with teams rappelling down the canyon walls and searching every accessible ledge and crevice. Helicopter overflights covered miles of the Yellowstone River downstream from the falls, looking for any sign that he might have fallen into the water. Nothing was found. David Brennan had simply vanished at the cliff edge, along with whatever had been making those mysterious tracks. Over the following months, I found myself returning to both locations during my regular patrols, looking for any new signs of the unusual tracks or any clues about what had happened to the missing tourist. The areas remained quiet, showing only normal wildlife activity and the typical boot prints from hikers and photographers. But in November, during an early season snowfall, I made a discovery that convinced me the mystery was far from over. I was checking trail conditions after the first significant snow of the winter when I found fresh tracks in the powder near the North Rim Trail overlook. The same impossibly large prints, the same unnatural precision in spacing, the same direct path toward the cliff edge. But this time, the tracks weren't alone in the snow. Following alongside the mysterious prints was a clear trail of human footprints. Not boot prints this time, but bare human feet. In November snow, at an elevation where temperatures were well below freezing. I followed both sets of tracks to the cliff edge, where they ended in the same abrupt manner I'd seen before. But this time, there was something new at the overlook. Carved into the trunk of a pine tree near the cliff edge was a message in fresh cuts. They showed me the way down. Now, I can fly. Below the message was carved a name. David Brennan. I photographed the carving and immediately radioed for backup, then spent the next hour searching the immediate area for any other signs of activity. But aside from the tracks and the carved message, there was no evidence that anyone had been there. When other rangers arrived to investigate, we conducted a thorough search of the overlook area and the forest beyond. We found no additional tracks, no camping equipment, no signs of recent human habitation. It was as if someone had appeared just long enough to carve that message, then vanished again. The carving was examined by forensic specialists who confirmed that it had been made very recently, within hours of when I'd found it. The depth and precision of the cuts suggested they'd been made with a sharp knife or similar tool, not improvised equipment. But how David Brennan could have made that carving, months after disappearing at the same location, was impossible to explain. DNA analysis of wood shavings from the carving revealed traces of human tissue, confirming that whoever had made the cuts had left biological material behind. But when the DNA profile was compared to samples from David Brennan's personal belongings, the results were inconclusive. "It's consistent with Brennan's profile," the forensic examiner told us. "But there are anomalies in the genetic markers that don't match normal human DNA. It's like the sample has been altered or degraded in ways we've never seen before." The investigation into David Brennan's disappearance was officially reopened, but no new evidence was found to explain how he could have returned to carve a message at the site where he'd vanished months earlier. I continued my regular patrols of the area throughout the winter, but didn't encounter any more unusual tracks or carvings. The mystery seemed to have gone dormant with the cold weather. But when spring returned and the snow began to melt, the activity resumed. In April of 2021, I found fresh tracks along the North Rim Trail again. The same large, unnatural prints, following the same precise path toward the cliff edge overlook. But this time, there were multiple sets of human footprints alongside the mysterious tracks. I counted at least 6 different sets of human prints, all heading in the same direction as the large unknown tracks. Men's boots, women's shoes, what looked like children's sneakers, all walking in formation toward the dangerous cliff edge. At the overlook, I found more carved messages in the trees. The deep ones showed us the truth. Flying is better than walking. Join us in the air. The canyon calls to all of us. Each message was carved in the same fresh, precise style as David Brennan's message from months earlier. And DNA analysis later confirmed that each carving contained biological material from different individuals, people who had no official connection to each other or to the park. But most disturbing of all was the final message, carved deeper than the others into the largest tree at the overlook. "Ranger Whitfield will understand soon. The tracks are calling to him too." I requested immediate backup and spent the rest of the day with other rangers examining every inch of the overlook area. We found no other signs of recent activity, no indication of how multiple people could have reached this remote location without being detected by park security. But that night, alone in my ranger cabin, I started hearing something that made my blood run cold. Tapping sounds outside my windows. The same rhythmic pattern I'd noticed in the spacing of those mysterious tracks. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. Continuing for hours in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. I looked outside with a flashlight but couldn't see anything in the darkness around my cabin. The tapping seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if I was surrounded by whatever was making the sound. The tapping continued every night for a week, always starting around midnight and continuing until dawn. I reported it to my supervisors, but when other rangers stayed overnight to investigate, the sounds didn't occur. It was only happening when I was alone. On the 7th night, the tapping was accompanied by something else. A voice calling my name from the darkness outside. "Amos!" the voice called. "Amos Whitfield, come outside. Come see what we found." The voice was human, but there was something wrong with it. Too flat, too emotionless, like someone reading words they didn't understand. "Amos Whitfield, the tracks are waiting for you. Come follow the tracks." I grabbed my radio and tried to call for backup, but all I got was static. My cell phone showed no signal, though it had been working fine earlier in the evening. "Come outside, Amos. Come see how we learned to fly." That's when I recognized the voice. It was David Brennan, the missing tourist from months earlier. But it was wrong somehow. The right voice saying the wrong things in the wrong tone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my cabin with my service weapon drawn, listening to voices calling my name from the darkness. Sometimes it was David Brennan's voice, sometimes other voices I didn't recognize. But they all said the same things. "Come, follow the tracks. Come see how we fly. The deep ones are waiting. Join us at the cliff edge." When dawn finally came, the voices stopped. I found tracks in the mud around my cabin, the same large, mysterious prints I'd been finding for months, circling my home like something had been pacing around it all night. I put in for an immediate transfer out of the Grand Canyon area that morning. I told my supervisors I had family issues that required me to relocate, but the truth was that I was terrified to continue working in an area where something was actively hunting me. My transfer was approved, and I'm now stationed in a different section of the park. But I still monitor reports from the Grand Canyon area, and the pattern continues. More tourists have gone missing from the canyon overlooks. More mysterious tracks have been found leading to cliff edges. More carved messages have appeared in trees, always describing flying and joining something called the Deep Ones. And other rangers have started reporting the same experiences I had. Tapping sounds outside their homes at night, voices calling their names from the darkness, radio and cell phone interference that only occurs when they're alone. Whatever is making those tracks, whatever is carving those messages, it's getting bolder. It's actively recruiting people now, calling to them from the darkness and leading them to the cliff edges where they disappear forever. The official reports describe these incidents as isolated missing persons cases with no clear connection. But I know the truth. Something is living in the depths of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone. Something that has learned to mimic human voices and behavior for the purpose of luring people to their deaths. The tracks continue to appear along the rim trails, always leading to the most dangerous overlooks. The voices continue to call from the darkness, using the names and voices of people who have disappeared. And the carved messages continue to appear in trees, describing flight and freedom and joining something that lives in the depths of the canyon. I don't know what the deep ones are that the messages refer to. I don't know how people learn to fly after following those tracks to the cliff edges. And I don't want to find out. But I know that somewhere in the darkness below the canyon rim, something is waiting. Something that has been collecting people for months, maybe years. Something that knows how to use our own voices against us, how to call us by name from the shadows, and lead us to places where we'll never be found. The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone is one of the most beautiful sights in North America. Millions of visitors stand at those overlooks every year, marveling at the power and majesty of the falls. Most of them have safe, wonderful experiences and go home with memories that last a lifetime. But sometimes, when the conditions are right, when you're alone at the overlooks during the quiet hours before dawn, you might hear something calling your name from the depths of the canyon. You might see tracks in the mud that don't belong to any creature that should exist in this world. And if you follow those tracks, if you listen to those voices calling from the darkness below, you might discover what it means to fly. But you'll never discover what it means to come home again. Working a winter assignment at Mammoth Hot Springs Ranger Station is supposed to be a quiet posting. Most tourists don't visit Yellowstone between November and March. The roads are closed to regular traffic, and the handful of winter visitors are usually experienced outdoors enthusiasts who know how to take care of themselves. It's a time for maintenance work, paperwork, and planning for the busy summer season. I volunteered for the winter isolation duty in 2018 because I needed the peace and quiet. My divorce had been finalized in September. I was dealing with some personal issues that required solitude to work through, and the idea of spending 4 months alone at a remote ranger station sounded like exactly what I needed. I've been a ranger for 15 years, worked in parks across the western United States, and I'm comfortable with isolation and wilderness conditions. I can handle maintenance tasks, basic repairs, and emergency situations. Winter duty at Mammoth Hot Springs seemed like an ideal assignment for someone in my situation. The station is located about 3 miles from the main Mammoth Hot Springs area, accessible by snowmobile during winter months when the roads are impassable for regular vehicles. It's a small but well-equipped facility. Living quarters, communications equipment, emergency medical supplies, and enough food and fuel to last through even the worst winter storms. My assignment began on November 15th, and for the first month, everything went exactly as expected. I settled into a routine of daily maintenance checks, radio communications with park headquarters, and the kind of solitary activities that help a man sort through his thoughts. Reading, writing in my journal, working on wood carving projects I'd been putting off for years. The station is surrounded by some of the most beautiful winter landscape you can imagine. Snow-covered pine forests, steaming hot springs that create ethereal fog patterns in the cold air, and wildlife that's adapted to the harsh conditions, elk, bison, and the occasional wolf pack moving through the area. During those first weeks, I saw exactly what I expected to see. Normal wildlife behavior, typical weather patterns, and the kind of pristine winter wilderness that makes you understand why people become addicted to this kind of work. But in mid-December, things started to change. It began with small things that I initially dismissed as products of isolation and stress. Sounds outside the station at night that didn't quite match normal wildlife activity. Shapes moving in the peripheral vision through the frosted windows. Equipment that I was certain I'd left in one location turning up somewhere else. The first real incident happened on December 18th, during a particularly heavy snowstorm that had been dumping powder for 3 days straight. I was doing my evening radio check with headquarters when the lights in the station flickered and went out. Power outages aren't uncommon during winter storms, and the station has a backup generator that should have kicked in automatically. But when I went to check the generator shed, I found the door standing wide open and snow blowing inside. I knew I had secured that door earlier in the day. The generator shed is one of the critical points in my daily inspection routine, and I never leave it unsecured. But the heavy wooden door was not just unlocked. It was standing completely open, as if someone had deliberately opened it and walked away. Inside the shed, the backup generator was shut off. Not failed, not damaged by the storm, but manually switched off. Someone had turned a series of switches and knobs to shut down the system, then left the shed door open to let the weather in. I restarted the generator and got the power back on, then spent the next hour checking every lock and security system in the station. Everything else was secure, with no signs of forced entry or tampering. Whoever had accessed the generator shed had either used a key or had technical knowledge of how to open the lock without damaging it. I radioed headquarters to report the incident. Base, this is Millfield at Mammoth Winter Station. I've had what appears to be unauthorized access to my generator facility. Someone shut down my backup power and left the shed unsecured during the storm. The response was immediate. Copy that, Millfield. Are you saying you have an intruder at your location? I'm not sure what I have. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being inside the main station. But someone definitely accessed the generator shed and knew exactly how to shut down the system. Roger, we're going to try to get a snowmobile team out to your location, but this storm may delay us until tomorrow morning. Can you secure your position until then? I confirmed that I could handle the situation overnight, but privately I was deeply concerned. The Mammoth Winter Station is miles from the nearest road, accessible only by snowmobile or snowshoes, and surrounded by wilderness that would be virtually impossible to navigate during a blizzard without intimate knowledge of the area. Who would have the skills and equipment to reach my location during a snowstorm, the technical knowledge to shut down my generator system, and the motivation to do so without taking anything or causing any other damage? I spent that night checking and double-checking every security measure in the station. I barricaded the doors with furniture, kept my service weapon close at hand, and maintained radio contact with headquarters every hour. But around 3 a.m., during one of the worst parts of the storm, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Knocking at the front door of the station. Not random sounds from the wind or debris hitting the building. Deliberate rhythmic knocking. 3 sets of 3 knocks, pause, 3 sets of 3 knocks, pause. Someone was standing outside my door in the middle of a blizzard, requesting entry. I grabbed my flashlight and weapon, then approached the door cautiously. The knocking continued, patient and persistent, while I tried to see outside through the small window beside the entrance. The snow was coming down so heavily that visibility was nearly zero, but I could make out a dark shape standing just outside the door. Human-sized, but perfectly motionless except for whatever was making the knocking sound. "This is Park Ranger Millfield," I called through the door. "Identify yourself." The knocking stopped immediately. I waited for a response, but heard nothing except the sound of wind and snow. After about 30 seconds, I called out again. "If you need emergency assistance, please respond. Otherwise, you need to leave this area immediately." Still no answer. I kept my flashlight trained on the window, watching for any movement outside. After about 5 minutes, the dark shape was gone. No footprints leading away, no sound of departure. It had simply disappeared. I radioed headquarters immediately. "Base, this is Millfield. I have had someone attempting to gain entry to the station. Individual appeared during the storm, knocked on the door, then disappeared when challenged. Request immediate backup." "Copy that, Millfield. Can you provide a description of the individual?" "Negative. Visibility was too poor due to the storm, but someone was definitely there, and they knew exactly where to find the station." "Roger. Backup team will depart at first light, weather permitting. Maintain secure position until then." I spent the rest of the night awake, watching the windows and monitoring the radio. The storm continued until dawn, but there were no more incidents. When the backup team arrived the next morning, we conducted a thorough search of the area around the station. The fresh snow had covered any tracks that might have been left by my mysterious visitor, but we found something else that was deeply disturbing. About 50 yards from the station, partially buried in the snow, was a set of items that definitely didn't belong in the wilderness. A park ranger uniform, complete with badge, radio, and equipment belt. But the uniform was old, an outdated style that hadn't been used by the Park Service for at least 20 years. More concerning still, the name tag on the uniform read Millfield C. My own name and initial, but on equipment that predated my employment with the Park Service by decades. "Where did this come from?" asked Ranger Williams, the leader of the backup team. "I have no idea," I replied honestly. This isn't my uniform, and I've never seen this style of equipment before, but that's definitely my name on the badge." We photographed everything and took the uniform back to headquarters for analysis. Investigation revealed that the uniform was authentic Park Service issue, but from a production run that had ended in 1987. The badge number was valid, but had never been assigned to any employee named Millfield in Park Service records. It was as if someone had created a uniform specifically for me using authentic materials and systems, but had backdated it by 30 years. The incident was thoroughly investigated, but no explanation was found for how the uniform had appeared near the station, who had left it there, or why it bore my name and identification. I returned to the winter station after the investigation, but requested that another ranger be assigned to work with me for the remainder of the winter. The isolation duty was no longer therapeutic. It was becoming genuinely frightening. Ranger Velma Santos joined me at the station in early January, and for a few weeks having another person around seemed to stabilize the situation. We settled into a routine of shared duties and the strange incidents stopped occurring. But in late January, during another heavy snowstorm, the activity resumed with a vengeance. It started when Velma reported that someone had been in her room while she was on duty outside the station. Personal items had been moved around. Her bed had been made with military precision that didn't match her normal habits, and her diary had been left open to a page she was certain she hadn't written. The diary entry, in handwriting that looked exactly like hers, read, "Chester is not who he claims to be. The real Chester Millfield died here years ago. This one is something else wearing his name." "I didn't write this," Velma told me, showing me the diary page. "I don't even remember thinking thoughts like this. But it's definitely my handwriting." I examined the entry carefully. It was indeed her handwriting, written with her pen in her diary. But Velma was adamant that she had no memory of writing it, and the content was completely contrary to her normal personality and thought patterns. "We need to report this to headquarters," I said. "Someone is accessing the station and manipulating our personal belongings." But when we tried to radio headquarters, we discovered that our communications equipment had been tampered with. The radio was functional but tuned to frequencies that didn't correspond to any Park Service channels. Instead of reaching our supervisors, we were picking up transmissions that sounded like old radio broadcasts from decades earlier. "Ranger Millfield reported missing during winter storm operations. Search teams unable to locate station personnel. Presumed dead after 3 days in sub-zero conditions." The broadcasts continued for hours, describing search and rescue operations for park rangers who had disappeared during winter assignments. But the dates mentioned in the broadcasts were from the 1980s and 1990s, decades before either Velma or I had started working for the Park Service. Most disturbing of all, many of the broadcasts mentioned rangers named Millfield and Santos, who had vanished during winter storms in the exact area where our station was located. "This is impossible," Velma said, listening to the reports. "These broadcasts are describing us, but they're dated 20 years ago." I tried manually tuning the radio to reach our headquarters, but every frequency produced the same vintage broadcasts describing missing rangers. It was as if our radio was somehow picking up transmissions from the past, or someone was deliberately broadcasting false historical reports. That night, the temperature dropped to 30 below zero, and the heating system in the station began to malfunction. Not mechanical failure, someone had been adjusting the controls to slowly reduce the heat output while we were asleep. We discovered the tampering when we woke up to find ice forming on the inside walls of the station. The thermostat had been manually lowered to its minimum setting, and someone had placed towels over the heating vents to block warm air circulation. "Someone is trying to freeze us to death," Velma said as we worked to restore the heating system. "They're sabotaging our equipment and trying to make it look like accidents." As we were repairing the heating system, we found something that explained some of the mysterious incidents. Hidden behind one of the heating panels was a collection of personal items that didn't belong to either of us. Old photographs of park rangers in vintage uniforms, including several pictures of people who looked exactly like Velma and me, but were clearly taken decades earlier. Personnel files with our names and photographs, but employment dates from the 1980s. And most disturbing of all, death certificates for Chester Millfield and Velma Santos, dated 1987 and 1992 respectively. According to the documents, we had both died during winter assignments at remote ranger stations, victims of equipment failures and exposure during severe storms. "This is someone's idea of a sick joke," I said, but even as I said it, I knew it didn't feel like a prank. The documents were too detailed, too authentic-looking, too precisely targeted at our specific situation. We gathered all the hidden materials and tried again to contact headquarters, but our radio continued to pick up only the vintage broadcasts describing missing and dead rangers. We were completely cut off from outside communication, trapped in a station where someone was systematically sabotaging our equipment and leaving evidence that suggested we were already dead. That's when we decided to leave the station and hike out to civilization on foot. It was a dangerous decision, attempting to travel cross-country in winter conditions with temperatures well below zero. But staying in the station was becoming more dangerous than leaving it. We packed emergency supplies and survival gear, then began the trek toward the main Mammoth Hot Springs area where we knew we could find help. The snow was deep and the going was slow, but we made steady progress for the first few hours. But as we were crossing a large meadow about 2 miles from the station, we saw something that made us stop dead in our tracks. Ahead of us in the snow were 2 sets of tracks, human footprints heading in the same direction we were traveling. The tracks were fresh, made within the last few hours, but they were impossible. The footprints matched our boots exactly. Same size, same tread pattern, same stride length. It was as if we had already passed through this area, but neither of us had any memory of being there before. "How is this possible?" Velma asked, kneeling down to examine the prints more closely. I compared the tracks to my boots and found they matched perfectly. Every detail of the sole pattern, every wear mark, even the slight damage to the left heel that I'd gotten from catching my foot on a rock the previous week. "Someone is wearing identical boots and following our planned route," I said. "But who would have access to boots exactly like ours?" We followed the mysterious tracks for about half a mile before they led to something that defied all logical explanation. In a small grove of pine trees, we found a campsite that looked exactly like our emergency setup. Same type of tent, same sleeping bags, same survival equipment. But the campsite was old, covered with snow that had clearly been accumulating for weeks. Inside the tent, we found more personal items that belonged to us, but that we knew we hadn't brought on this trip. My journal, filled with entries I had no memory of writing. Velma's camera containing photographs of locations we'd never visited. And most terrifying of all, we found our own bodies. 2 corpses, frozen solid, wearing park ranger uniforms identical to the ones we were currently wearing. The bodies were in advanced stages of decomposition, clearly dead for months, but they were unmistakably us. "This isn't possible," Velma whispered, staring at her own frozen corpse. "I'm standing right here. I'm alive." I examined the body that looked like me and found it was wearing my watch, my ring, even my dental work. It was physically identical to me in every detail, but it had obviously been dead for a very long time. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Something is very wrong with this entire situation." But when we turned to leave the campsite, we found that our footprints in the snow had vanished. The tracks we'd followed to reach this location were gone, and there was no clear path leading back toward civilization. We were lost in a winter wilderness, surrounded by evidence that we were already dead, with no way to navigate back to safety. That's when we heard the voices calling our names from the forest around us. "Chester," came a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Velma," came another voice that was perfectly Velma's. But the voices were coming from different directions, as if multiple versions of ourselves were scattered through the woods. "Chester, where are you?" called my voice. "We need to get back to the station." "Velma, help me," called her voice. "I'm lost in the snow." We stood back to back in the center of the campsite, listening to our own voices calling to us from the darkness of the forest. Sometimes the voices seemed far away. Sometimes they seemed close enough that the speakers should have been visible. But we never saw anyone, just heard our own voices, multiplied and scattered through the woods, calling for help and guidance that we couldn't provide. "This isn't real," Velma said. "None of this is real. We're hallucinating from hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning or something." But even as she said it, I could see she didn't believe it. The physical evidence was too concrete, too detailed, too precisely targeted at our specific identities and situation. "We need to find shelter and wait for rescue," I said. "Headquarters will send a team when we miss our next radio check." But when we tried to contact headquarters on our portable radio, we got the same vintage broadcasts we'd been hearing at the station. Reports of missing rangers, descriptions of winter search and rescue operations, and detailed accounts of our own deaths in incidents that had supposedly occurred decades earlier. We spent that night huddled in our survival shelter, listening to voices that sounded like us calling from the forest. Sometimes the voices seemed to be having conversations with each other, discussing Park Service operations and winter survival techniques. Sometimes they called our names, asking for help or directions. But whenever we responded to the voices, they would immediately stop, as if whatever was making the sounds could only function when we weren't actively participating. By morning, the voices had stopped, but the snow had begun falling again. Heavy, wind-driven snow that would make travel impossible and eliminate any tracks we might try to follow. We were trapped in a landscape where all the normal rules seemed to have been suspended, where our own bodies lay frozen in a tent while we remained alive and conscious, where our voices called to us from an invisible source, where radio broadcasts described our deaths in events that had occurred before we were born. "I think we need to go back to the station," Velma said. "Whatever is happening here, maybe we can figure it out if we're in a familiar environment with better equipment." I agreed, though privately I suspected that returning to the station would only trap us more completely in whatever was happening to us. We packed our gear and began hiking back toward the station, following our own footprints from the previous day. But the tracks led us in directions that didn't match our memory of the route we'd taken. Instead of the direct path we remembered, the footprints took us through dense forest, across frozen streams, and past landmarks we'd never seen before. It was as if the versions of ourselves who had made these tracks had taken a completely different route through terrain that shouldn't have existed. The tracks led us to the station, but when we arrived, we found it exactly as we'd left it, except for one crucial difference. Posted on the front door was a missing persons notice. 2 official Park Service flyers with our photographs and descriptions, stating that Rangers Chester Millfield and Velma Santos had been reported missing during winter storm operations and were presumed dead. The notices were dated 3 months earlier, before either of us had been assigned to the winter station. "According to this, we've been missing since October," Velma said, reading the notices. "But we didn't start this assignment until November." I examined the paperwork more closely and found it was authentic Park Service documentation. Official forms, correct formatting, genuine signatures from our supervisors. But the dates and circumstances described were impossible. "Someone has been planning this for months," I said. "They created false missing persons reports, planted evidence of our deaths, and manipulated our assignment to bring us to this location." But even as I said it, I knew the explanation didn't make sense. The level of preparation and resources required to orchestrate something like this would be enormous, and the motivation was completely unclear. Who would go to such elaborate lengths to convince two park rangers that they were dead? What could possibly be gained from such an operation? We entered the station and found more evidence of our supposed deaths. Death certificates posted on our desks, memorial service programs with our names and photographs, even condolence letters from Park Service colleagues we'd never met. All dated months before our current assignment, all referring to incidents that neither of us had any memory of experiencing. "I'm going to try the radio one more time," I said. "Maybe we can reach someone who can explain what's happening here." But when I turned on the communications equipment, instead of the vintage broadcasts we'd been hearing, I got a clear signal to Park Service headquarters. "Mammoth Winter Station, this is base. We've been trying to reach you for days. What's your status?" "Base, this is Millfield. We're experiencing some kind of emergency situation here. We've found evidence suggesting that we've been reported missing and presumed dead, but we're obviously alive and functional." There was a long pause before the response came. "Millfield, you were reported missing 3 months ago. The winter station has been empty since October. Who is this?" "This is Chester Millfield, assigned to winter duty at Mammoth Station with Ranger Santos. We've been here since November." Another pause, then, "Sir, Chester Millfield and Velma Santos died in a winter storm in October. Their bodies were recovered and buried. The station has been closed since then. If you're at that location, you're trespassing on federal property." The radio went silent. I looked at Velma, who had been listening to the entire conversation with increasing horror. "They think we're dead," she said. "Headquarters thinks we died months ago." "Or," I said, a terrible possibility occurring to me, "we did die months ago, and whatever we are now isn't what we used to be." That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. In the mirror across the room, I could see Velma sitting next to me, but my own reflection wasn't there. I was casting no reflection at all. I turned to point this out to Velma, but when I looked directly at her, she wasn't there either. The chair where she'd been sitting was empty, but I could still hear her voice. "Chester, where did you go? I can't see you anymore." "I'm right here," I called back. "But I can't see you either." "Something is happening to us," her voice said from the empty air. "Something has been happening to us for months." I looked in the mirror again and saw the station exactly as it should appear, but completely empty. No people, no signs of recent habitation. Just an abandoned building with dust covers over the furniture and signs of long vacancy. "Velma?" I called. "I think we need to accept the possibility that we really did die in October." "Then what are we now?" her voice asked. "What have we been doing here for months?" I had no answer for that question, but I understood now why the radio had been picking up broadcasts about missing rangers, why we'd found our own bodies in the forest, why headquarters thought we'd been dead for months. We had been dead for months. Whatever we were now, ghosts, spirits, some kind of psychological echo, we'd been replaying our final assignment over and over again, trapped in a loop that began with our deaths and ended with the gradual realization that we were no longer alive. "I remember now," Velma's voice said. "I remember the storm in October. I remember the heating system failing. I remember freezing to death in the station while trying to repair the equipment. And suddenly, I remembered too. The blizzard that had lasted for days, the generator failure, the desperate attempt to reach headquarters for help, the slow, cold death as hypothermia set in and our equipment froze around us. "We've been dead for 3 months," I said. "We've been replaying our death over and over again, not understanding what happened to us." "But why?" Velma's voice asked. "Why are we still here?" I looked around the abandoned station, understanding finally why everything had felt so wrong, why the evidence had been so contradictory, why our own voices had been calling to us from the forest. "Because we never accepted it," I said. "We died, but we couldn't let go. We kept trying to complete our assignment, kept trying to survive a situation we'd already failed to survive. "What do we do now?" she asked. I thought about that question for a long time, standing in the abandoned station that had been our tomb for months, listening to the voice of my colleague who had died beside me in the snow. "I think," I said finally, "we need to stop trying to survive. We need to accept what happened and let go." "I'm scared," Velma's voice said. "Me too," I replied. "But I think being scared is keeping us trapped here." The station began to grow dim around me, as if the lights were slowly failing. But instead of the fear and desperation I'd felt during our previous equipment failures, I felt a strange sense of peace. "Chester," Velma's voice said, growing fainter. "Thank you for being here with me." "Thank you too," I said. "I don't think I could have figured this out alone." The last thing I remember was the sound of wind through empty rooms and the feeling of finally, after months of struggle, allowing myself to rest. The Mammoth Winter Station was found empty when maintenance crews arrived in the spring. The bodies of Rangers Chester Millfield and Velma Santos were discovered where they had died months earlier, victims of equipment failure during an unexpected October blizzard. The official reports noted that both Rangers had followed proper emergency procedures and had died while attempting to repair critical systems during extreme weather conditions. They were buried with full honors, and the station was upgraded with additional safety equipment to prevent similar tragedies. But every winter since then, other Rangers assigned to isolated duties have reported strange experiences. Voices calling from empty rooms, equipment that operates by itself, and the occasional glimpse of two figures in Park Service uniforms working diligently at tasks that never seem to get completed. The experiences are never threatening, never dangerous, just the presence of two dedicated Rangers who remain committed to their duties even after death, still trying to complete an assignment that ended with their lives 3 months before they understood they were dead. Some say that on particularly cold winter nights, you can still hear radio transmissions from the Mammoth Winter Station. Reports of equipment status, weather conditions, and two Rangers working together to maintain safety and security in the wilderness areas of Yellowstone. They're still on duty, still protecting the park and its visitors, still learning to accept what happened to them during that October storm when the heating failed and the cold finally won. But now they're no longer trapped by the need to survive something they couldn't survive. Now they're just helping others avoid the same fate, offering assistance from beyond the boundary between life and death to ensure that no other Rangers die alone in the winter darkness of Yellowstone's most isolated stations. Old Faithful is the crown jewel of Yellowstone National Park. Every day, thousands of tourists gather around the viewing areas to watch the world's most predictable geyser send a column of superheated water and steam 150 feet into the air. It's been erupting reliably every 60 to 110 minutes for as long as anyone has been keeping records, and it's one of the most studied geothermal features on Earth. I've been working as a ranger in the Old Faithful area for 8 years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about the geyser and the surrounding thermal features. The eruption patterns, the underground plumbing system, the geological forces that create the spectacular displays that draw millions of visitors from around the world. But what I experienced during the autumn of 2022 taught me that there are aspects of the Old Faithful area that aren't covered in any geological survey, any scientific study, or any ranger training manual. It started in late September, during the transition period between the busy summer tourist season and the quieter winter months. Most of the seasonal staff had already left for the year, and those of us remaining were settling into the routine of reduced operations and maintenance work that fills the off-season. I was conducting a routine inspection of the thermal features around Old Faithful when I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. The geyser's eruption pattern, which had been remarkably consistent for decades, was showing subtle but definite changes. Instead of the normal 60 to 110-minute intervals between eruptions, Old Faithful was erupting every 47 minutes with clockwork precision. Not variable timing within a predictable range. Exactly 47 minutes between eruptions, measured to the second. This kind of sudden change in eruption patterns isn't unheard of, but it's unusual enough to warrant investigation. Geysers can be affected by earthquakes, changes in underground water flow, or shifts in the surrounding thermal features. As the senior ranger in the area, it was my responsibility to monitor the situation and report any significant changes to park geologists. I began keeping detailed logs of eruption times, documenting the precise interval between each display. Over the course of a week, Old Faithful erupted every 47 minutes without deviation. Not 46 minutes, not 48 minutes, exactly 47 minutes, as if someone had reset a timer that controlled the underground processes. But the change in timing wasn't the only unusual aspect of the geyser's behavior. The eruptions themselves were different from what I'd observed during my 8 years in the area. Normally, Old Faithful's eruptions begin with small bursts of water and steam that gradually build to the main column. The display reaches its peak height, maintains it for several minutes, then gradually subsides as the underground pressure decreases. But these new eruptions were following a completely different pattern. They would begin normally, with the familiar buildup of pressure and the gradual increase in height. But at exactly the 3-minute mark of each eruption, something strange would happen. The column of water and steam would suddenly take on a different quality. Instead of the normal chaotic turbulence you'd expect from superheated water under pressure, the column would become smooth, almost geometric in its precision. And for exactly 30 seconds, the water would appear to flow upward in perfect spirals, creating patterns that looked almost artificial. I photographed these unusual eruption patterns and sent the images to Dr. Margaret Foster, the park's consulting geologist. Her response was immediate and concerned. "Silas, these photographs show patterns that don't match any known geyser behavior. The spiral formations you've captured are geometrically perfect, which is physically impossible for a natural water eruption. Are you certain these images haven't been digitally manipulated?" I assured her that the photographs were completely unaltered and invited her to observe the geyser firsthand during her next visit to the park. Dr. Foster arrived 2 days later, equipped with high-speed cameras and measurement instruments to document the unusual behavior. We positioned ourselves at the standard viewing area and waited for the next eruption. At exactly 47 minutes after the previous eruption, Old Faithful began its display. For the first 3 minutes, everything appeared normal. The familiar buildup, the reaching column of water and steam, the peak height that tourists expect to see. But at the 3-minute mark, Dr. Foster's expression changed to one of complete bewilderment. "This is impossible," she muttered, adjusting her camera settings to capture the spiral patterns forming in the water column. "Water under pressure doesn't behave this way. There's no natural process that could create these geometric formations." The spirals were clearly visible to the naked eye, rotating in perfect synchronization and maintaining their shape for exactly 30 seconds before the eruption returned to normal patterns and gradually subsided. "How long has this been happening?" Dr. Foster asked. "About 2 weeks," I replied. "Every eruption, same timing, same patterns." Dr. Foster spent the next 3 days observing and documenting the unusual behavior. Her instruments confirmed what we could see with our eyes. The water column was indeed forming perfect geometric spirals during that 30-second window, and the timing of the eruptions had become unnaturally precise. "I've studied geysers around the world for 20 years, she told me as she prepared to leave. "I've never seen anything like this. The behavior you're documenting doesn't fit any known geological model." "What could cause changes like this?" I asked. "I have no idea," she admitted. "Changes in underground water flow could affect timing, but not with this kind of precision. And I can't think of any natural process that would create those spiral patterns." It's like someone has installed machinery underground to control the eruption characteristics. The idea of underground machinery was obviously absurd, but Dr. Foster's comment stuck with me as I continued monitoring the geyser over the following weeks. The behavior remained consistent. Exactly 47 minutes between eruptions. Perfect spiral patterns for 30 seconds at the 3-minute mark of each display. But in early October, the unusual behavior began to spread to other thermal features in the area. Grand Geyser, which normally erupts irregularly every 6 to 8 hours, began erupting every 4 hours and 23 minutes with the same clockwork precision as Old Faithful. Castle Geyser, which typically has intervals of 10 to 12 hours, shifted to erupting every 7 hours and 11 minutes. Even the smaller thermal features, hot springs, fumaroles, and mud pots, began showing synchronized behavior. Steam vents that had operated independently for decades were now releasing vapor in coordinated pulses, creating patterns across the thermal field that looked almost choreographed. I reported these changes to park headquarters and requested additional scientific consultation. The response was swift and concerned. A team of geologists, hydrologists, and thermal specialists was dispatched to investigate what appeared to be unprecedented changes in the entire Old Faithful geyser basin. The investigation team arrived in mid-October and immediately began comprehensive monitoring of all thermal features in the area. They installed seismic equipment to detect underground changes, thermal sensors to measure temperature variations, and cameras to document the unusual eruption patterns. Dr. Foster returned as part of the team, along with Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in geothermal systems from the U.S. Geological Survey, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a hydrologist who had worked on similar phenomena in Iceland and New Zealand. For a week, the team documented the synchronized behavior of the thermal features, confirming that the entire geyser basin was operating with a level of coordination that defied natural explanation. "It's like someone threw a switch," Dr. Morrison told me during one of our evening briefings. Dozens of independent geothermal features, each with their own underground plumbing systems, suddenly began operating in synchronized patterns. There's no known geological process that could cause this kind of coordination. "Could it be seismic activity?" I asked. "An earthquake that changed the underground structure?" "We've checked all seismic data for the past 6 months," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "No significant earthquake activity in the region, and even if there had been, seismic changes typically make geyser behavior more irregular, not more precise." The team's instruments were recording data around the clock, but their findings only deepened the mystery. The synchronized eruptions were occurring with mathematical precision that exceeded the accuracy of the best atomic clocks. The spiral patterns in the water columns were geometrically perfect, showing no variation from one eruption to the next. Most puzzling of all, the thermal sensors were detecting temperature anomalies that didn't correspond to any known geothermal processes. Instead of the gradual temperature changes you'd expect from underground water heating and cooling, the instruments were recording sudden, precise temperature spikes that occurred in perfect synchronization across multiple thermal features. "It's as if something is controlling the temperature of the underground water supply," Dr. Foster explained. "But the energy requirements for that kind of control would be enormous, and we have no idea what the source could be." On October 23rd, during the second week of the scientific investigation, I made a discovery that changed the entire nature of the mystery. I was conducting a routine evening patrol of the geyser basin, checking for tourist safety hazards and monitoring the thermal features, when I noticed a soft glow emanating from the ground near Castle Geyser. At first, I thought it might be reflected light from the nearby visitor center, but as I approached the source, I realized the glow was coming from beneath the ground itself. A soft bluish light was filtering up through cracks in the mineral deposits around the geyser's vent. I radioed the investigation team immediately. "Base, this is Drummond. I'm observing an unusual light phenomenon at Castle Geyser. Request immediate scientific consultation." Dr. Foster and her team arrived within minutes, carrying portable spectrometers and light measurement equipment. What they found defied their understanding of geothermal processes. The blue glow was indeed emanating from deep underground, filtering up through the natural fractures in the mineral-rich ground around the geyser. But spectroscopic analysis revealed that the light wasn't being produced by any known geological process. This isn't bioluminescence, it's not chemical phosphorescence, and it's not reflection from any external source, Dr. Morrison said, studying the readings on his instruments. The light appears to be generated by some kind of energy source deep underground, but the wavelength signature doesn't match anything in our databases. As we watched, the blue glow began to pulse in slow, regular rhythms. The pulsing was synchronized with the eruption patterns we'd been observing. A soft flash of light would emanate from underground exactly 60 seconds before each thermal feature was scheduled to erupt. It's like a countdown timer, I observed. The light is announcing when the next eruption will occur. Dr. Rodriguez was taking photographs of the phenomenon when she noticed something that made her call us over urgently. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her camera's LCD display. "The photographs are showing something that's not visible to the naked eye." In the digital images, the blue glow was much more extensive than what we could see directly. The photographs revealed an intricate network of light patterns spreading underground across the entire geyser basin, connecting all the thermal features in a complex geometric grid. According to these images, there's some kind of luminous structure underneath the entire area, Dr. Foster said, studying the photographs. A network that connects every geyser, hot spring, and thermal vent in the basin. We spent the rest of the night documenting the light phenomenon, taking hundreds of photographs and collecting spectroscopic data. But when dawn broke, the blue glow faded and became invisible, even to the cameras. "It only appears at night," Dr. Morrison noted, "or at least it's only visible when ambient light levels are low enough." The investigation team expanded their monitoring to include round-the-clock observation of the light phenomenon. Night after night, the blue glow would appear after sunset, revealing the intricate underground network that seemed to be controlling the synchronized behavior of the thermal features. But on October 30th, the phenomenon evolved into something much more disturbing. I was conducting my evening patrol when I noticed that the blue glow was much brighter than usual, and it was accompanied by something I'd never seen before. Shapes moving within the light. Not random flickers or natural variations in intensity, but deliberate, purposeful movement. Dark silhouettes that appeared to be swimming or floating through the luminous underground network, moving from one thermal feature to another with obvious intelligence and intent. I called the investigation team immediately, and we spent hours watching the shapes move through the underground light grid. They appeared to be roughly humanoid in form, but elongated and flowing in a way that suggested they weren't bound by normal physical constraints. "Are we looking at some kind of underground life form?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. "I don't see how that's possible," Dr. Foster replied. "The temperatures down there exceed anything that known life forms could survive. We're talking about superheated water and steam at temperatures well over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But the shapes continued to move through the network with obvious purpose, appearing to operate or maintain the system that was controlling the geyser eruptions. We watched them gather at junction points in the light grid, work in coordinated groups to manipulate something we couldn't see, then disperse to other areas of the network. "They're intelligent," I said, watching the coordinated behavior. "Whatever they are, they're working together to operate this system." Dr. Morrison was recording everything with his instruments, but the readings were unlike anything he'd encountered in decades of geothermal research. "The energy signatures are off the charts," he said. "Whatever is generating this light and controlling these thermal features is operating on a scale that exceeds any known geothermal process. This is technology, not geology." "Technology operated by what?" Dr. Foster asked. watching another group of the elongated shapes gather around what appeared to be a control nexus deep underground. That question haunted us for the next several days as we continued to observe the phenomenon. The shapes appeared every night, working in the underground light network with obvious intelligence and purpose. The synchronized geyser eruptions continued with mathematical precision, and the blue glow revealed more and more details of the vast underground system. But on November 5th, we discovered that whatever was operating the underground network had become aware of our observation. I was photographing the light patterns when I noticed that one of the dark shapes had separated from the network and was moving directly toward my location. Not randomly drifting, but heading straight for the spot where I was standing on the surface. As the shape approached, the blue glow began to intensify in the ground directly beneath my feet. I could feel warmth radiating up through my boots, and the thermal sensors were recording rapidly increasing temperatures in the soil. "Drummond, get away from there," Dr. Foster called. "The ground temperature is spiking beyond safe levels." I backed away from the hot spot, but the dark shape in the underground network continued to track my movement. Wherever I walked, the blue glow would intensify beneath me, and the thermal readings would spike to dangerous levels. "It's following me," I reported. "Whatever that thing is, it knows where I am, and it's responding to my position." The other members of the investigation team began experiencing the same phenomenon. As soon as they positioned themselves to observe the underground network, dark shapes would break away from their tasks and move to positions directly below the observers. "They know we're watching them," Dr. Rodriguez said, "and they don't like it." That night, the entire character of the phenomenon changed. Instead of the purposeful, maintenance-like activities we'd been observing, the shapes in the underground network began moving in aggressive territorial patterns. They gathered in large groups at points directly beneath our observation positions, and the blue glow took on a harsh, pulsing quality that was almost hostile. The synchronized geyser eruptions became more violent, shooting water and steam to heights that exceeded anything in the historical record. Old Faithful, which normally reaches 150 feet, was erupting to over 300 feet. The smaller geysers were producing displays that rivaled Grand Geyser at its most spectacular. "They're putting on a show," I realized. "They want us to leave." Dr. Foster was documenting the increased eruption activity when she noticed something that made her face go pale. "The thermal sensors are detecting coordinated temperature increases across the entire basin," she said. "If this continues, we could be looking at a catastrophic release of geothermal energy." "You mean like a volcanic eruption?" I asked. "I mean like nothing we've ever seen before. The energy levels we're recording suggest these things could superheat the entire geyser basin beyond anything the natural system could contain." The investigation team made the decision to temporarily evacuate the area while they analyzed their data and determined how to proceed. But as we were packing our equipment, the underground network sent us a final message. Every thermal feature in the basin erupted simultaneously. Old Faithful, Grand Geyser, Castle Geyser, and dozens of smaller features all sent columns of superheated water and steam into the air at exactly the same moment. The display was breathtaking and terrifying, a coordinated demonstration of power that made it clear we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding or control. The simultaneous eruption lasted for exactly 5 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The blue glow faded from the underground network, the dark shapes disappeared, and the thermal features returned to their normal, uncoordinated patterns. "Message received," Dr. Foster said grimly as we loaded the last of our equipment. "Whatever is down there, it doesn't want to be studied." The investigation team filed their reports with park headquarters and various scientific agencies, but the findings were so extraordinary that most of the data was classified as anomalous and filed away for future study. Officially, the synchronized geyser behavior was attributed to temporary changes in underground water flow due to seasonal variations. but I knew the truth. Something intelligent was living in the deep geothermal system beneath Old Faithful, something that had been operating the thermal features with technology far beyond human understanding. For reasons I couldn't comprehend, they had chosen to reveal themselves briefly, then retreat back into the depths when they realized they were being observed. The geyser basin returned to normal operations after the investigation team left. Old Faithful resumed its traditional eruption patterns, the other thermal features returned to their irregular schedules, and tourists continued to gather for the spectacular displays without any awareness of what had been lurking beneath their feet. But I continued to monitor the area during my regular duties, watching for any signs that the phenomenon might return. For months, everything remained normal. The geysers erupted according to their natural patterns. The hot springs bubbled and steamed in their usual chaotic manner, and the underground remained dark and invisible. But in March of 2023, during a quiet period when tourist visitation was at its lowest, I began to notice subtle signs that the underground intelligence was still active. Not the dramatic synchronized eruptions or the obvious blue glow of the previous autumn, but small, almost hidden indicators that something was still operating beneath the surface. Old Faithful's eruption intervals, while not returning to the precise 47-minute timing, were showing mathematical relationships that were too perfect to be natural. Eruption times that, when analyzed over weeks of observation, revealed patterns based on prime numbers and geometric progressions. The other thermal features were showing similar hidden patterns. Eruption sequences that appeared random to casual observation, but revealed complex mathematical relationships when studied in detail. They're still there, I realized. They're just being more subtle about it. I began keeping detailed logs again, documenting the hidden mathematical patterns in the geyser eruptions. Over months of observation, I discovered that the underground intelligence was encoding messages in the timing of the thermal displays. Sequences of eruption intervals that, when converted to numbers and analyzed, spelled out words and phrases in various languages. Mathematical equations that described advanced physics concepts far beyond current human understanding. Even what appeared to be star charts and astronomical data for regions of space that human telescopes hadn't yet explored. The intelligence beneath Old Faithful was trying to communicate, but in a way that would only be detected by someone who was specifically looking for patterns and willing to invest the time and effort to decode their messages. I spent months working on the mathematical puzzles embedded in the eruption patterns, gradually learning to understand the symbolic language the underground intelligence was using. Most of the messages were scientific, descriptions of geological processes, explanations of geothermal physics, and information about the deep Earth systems that no human scientist had ever studied. But some of the messages were more personal, clearly directed at me as the observer who had discovered their activities. Surface dweller watches from above. One sequence of eruption intervals translated to, underground dwellers work from below. Both protect the thermal harmony. Your instruments detect our presence. Another message revealed. Our instruments detect your consciousness. We are aware of awareness. And most remarkably, the deep systems require maintenance. We perform maintenance. Surface systems require maintenance. You perform maintenance. Different species, same purpose. I began to understand that whatever was living in the geothermal system beneath Yellowstone wasn't hostile or alien in the way I had initially feared. They were caretakers, intelligences that had evolved or developed to maintain the complex thermal systems that create the geysers and hot springs that millions of visitors come to see. They had revealed themselves during the investigation because they wanted us to understand that the thermal features weren't just natural phenomena. They were carefully maintained systems that required constant attention and sophisticated management to function properly. You study surface thermal features, one of their most complex messages translated to, we study deep thermal features. Knowledge shared benefits all systems. Over the following months, I developed a form of communication with the underground intelligence using the eruption timing patterns of smaller thermal features that weren't closely monitored by tourists or other park staff. I would encode questions into the timing of my observation visits, and they would respond with answers embedded in the subsequent eruption patterns. Through this painstaking process, I learned that the underground intelligence had been present in the Yellowstone thermal system for thousands of years, maintaining the delicate balance of pressures and temperatures that keep the geysers functioning. They were not visitors or invaders, but an integral part of the ecosystem that had developed alongside the geological processes. They were also aware of the millions of tourists who came to see the thermal displays, and they took pride in maintaining the spectacular eruptions that brought joy and wonder to surface visitors. The synchronized displays they had created during the investigation were their way of showing off their capabilities, demonstrating that the natural beauty people traveled thousands of miles to see was actually the result of careful, intelligent management. Surface dwellers bring happiness energy, one of their messages explained. Underground dwellers maintain happiness source. Cooperation serves all consciousness. But they were also concerned about the long-term stability of the thermal systems. Climate change, seismic activity, and human industrial activity were all affecting the deep geological processes that fed the geysers. The underground intelligence was working constantly to compensate for these changes, but they were facing challenges that exceeded their technological capabilities. Deep systems changing faster than adaptation allows. They communicated through a complex sequence of eruption patterns. Surface consciousness must understand deep system vulnerability. I realized that the underground intelligence was trying to warn us about potential threats to the Yellowstone thermal features. They had revealed themselves not to frighten us away, but to establish communication with surface dwellers who might be able to help protect the geothermal systems from external threats. But how could I convey this information to park management or scientific authorities without being dismissed as delusional? The evidence I had collected was circumstantial at best, and the communication method was so subtle that it would be almost impossible to demonstrate to skeptical observers. I decided to continue my private communication with the underground intelligence while gradually introducing the concept of hidden patterns in geyser behavior to other rangers and researchers. If I could get others to start looking for mathematical relationships in eruption timing, perhaps they would discover the communication system on their own. But in August of 2023, the situation took on new urgency when the underground intelligence sent me a message that was impossible to ignore. Through a series of precisely timed eruptions across multiple thermal features, they encoded a detailed warning about seismic activity building in the deep magma systems beneath Yellowstone. According to their data, pressure was accumulating in underground chambers that could lead to significant geological events within the next several months. Deep pressure building beyond normal parameters, their message warned. Surface systems will be affected. Surface consciousness should prepare for thermal disruption. I knew I had to act on this warning, regardless of how it might affect my credibility. I compiled all my data on the hidden communication patterns and requested a meeting with park management to discuss potential seismic threats to thermal features based on unusual pattern analysis. The meeting was scheduled for September 15th. And I spent weeks preparing a presentation that would introduce the concept of intelligent pattern recognition in geyser behavior without immediately jumping to the conclusion that we were communicating with an underground intelligence. But on September 12th, 3 days before my scheduled presentation, the underground intelligence made their final, unmistakable demonstration of their presence and capabilities. At exactly 3:33 p.m., every thermal feature in the Old Faithful Basin erupted simultaneously for the second time in recorded history. The display lasted for exactly 7 minutes and 33 seconds, during which time the eruptions formed precise geometric patterns visible from the air. Photographers and tourists captured images of the synchronized eruption that clearly showed the coordinated nature of the display. Social media was flooded with pictures and videos of what appeared to be an impossible natural phenomenon. But embedded in the timing and patterns of the display was a final message for me. Surface consciousness now has evidence. Deep consciousness withdraws to allow surface investigation. Cooperation when surface consciousness ready. After the spectacular synchronized eruption, the mathematical patterns in the geyser timing stopped. The underground intelligence had provided unmistakable evidence of their presence, then retreated to allow human scientists to study and understand what they had witnessed. My presentation to park management became part of a much larger investigation into the extraordinary synchronized eruption event. Teams of geologists, mathematicians, and computer scientists were brought in to analyze the patterns and timing of the display. I shared my data on the hidden communication patterns, and while many of the researchers remained skeptical about the intelligence aspect, they couldn't deny that the eruption patterns showed mathematical relationships that were far too complex to be coincidental. The investigation is ongoing, and I'm no longer the only person who believes that something intelligent is operating in the deep geothermal systems of Yellowstone. We're developing new methods for detecting and analyzing pattern-based communication, and we're gradually building a scientific framework for understanding how an underground intelligence might coexist with natural geological processes. But the underground intelligence has remained silent since their final demonstration. No more mathematical patterns in eruption timing, no more hidden messages encoded in thermal behavior. They've given us the evidence we needed to begin studying them seriously, and now they're waiting to see if we can develop the scientific sophistication to establish meaningful communication. Old Faithful continues to erupt for millions of visitors every year, sending columns of superheated water and steam into the air with the reliability that has made it one of the world's most famous natural attractions. Tourists gather around the viewing areas, cameras ready, watching for the spectacular display that never fails to inspire awe and wonder. But now I know that they're watching something much more remarkable than a natural geological process. They're witnessing the carefully maintained work of an ancient intelligence that has been caring for these thermal systems for millennia, ensuring that the beauty and wonder of Yellowstone's geysers continues to inspire and delight visitors from around the world. The underground intelligence is still there, still working in the deep thermal systems, still maintaining the delicate balance that creates the spectacular eruptions we all come to see. They're waiting for us to develop the wisdom and sophistication to join them in caring for these remarkable geological features. And someday, when we're ready to accept that intelligence can take forms we never expected, they'll emerge from the depths again to teach us how to be proper caretakers of the wonders that lie beneath our feet. Until then, they continue their patient work in the darkness below, ensuring that Old Faithful remains faithful, and that the magic of Yellowstone's thermal features continues to remind us that there are still mysteries in this world that exceed our understanding. The next time you visit Old Faithful, watch the eruption carefully. Look for patterns in the timing, mathematical relationships in the intervals, hidden messages in the spectacular display of water and steam, because you might be witnessing not just a natural phenomenon, but a form of communication from an intelligence that has been waiting thousands of years for us to become wise enough to listen. The rain continues to fall on the thermal basin, creating steam that rises from the hot springs and mingles with the mist from the geysers. In that steam, in the mathematical precision of the eruptions, in the ancient rhythms that have been maintained for millennia, something waits patiently for humanity to grow wise enough to understand. The geysers keep their schedules, the underground intelligence keeps its secrets, and the tourists keep coming to witness the daily miracles that occur when superheated water meets the open air in perfect, carefully maintained harmony. But beneath it all, in the deep places where no human has ever ventured, the real caretakers of Yellowstone continue their eternal work, ensuring that the wonders we come to see remain wonderful, and that the mysteries we've yet to solve continue to remind us how much we still have to learn about the world beneath our feet.